Welcome to Idiot Proof, the podcast dedicated to digital ID. Your hosts are the lovely Sally McKenzie and myself, Rob Hotchin.
We hope you enjoy listening and maybe even learn a thing or two. I know I will. In this episode, we are thrilled to be speaking with a leader at the forefront of digital identity innovation in Australia, Andrew Black. Andrew heads ConnectID, which has just become Australia's first digital identity exchange. This groundbreaking platform enables Australians to take greater control over their identity and data while providing organisations with a secure way to verify customers, unlocking real value and reducing security risks. With a strong background in digital identity, Andrew has worked with both state and federal governments here in Australia, as well as international organisations to shape the future of technology and policy aimed at protecting citizen data and rights. Today, we'll be exploring the factors driving Australia's shift towards digital ID and what it will take to make it a trusted everyday tool for individuals and businesses. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Pleasure.
We've got some questions lined up, but did we do ConnectID a good service with our introduction? Is there anything we missed? How would you like to explain for the masses of our listeners?
Pretty good job. We're a trust network, and I guess the thing that differentiates us from others is that you don't have a ConnectID. We're sort of a bridge to let you use an ID you've already set up, right? So in our case, that's one of the four major banks as a starting point. So you can reuse, one of your banks to re-verify and have a reusable identity that you can take around, log in, verify, use places. It's exciting. We're sort of just over a year into our first birthday just passed, which is very exciting. As someone who's just had a child's first birthday party as well, there was a lot less cake and sprinkles at that one. But it's been a fun first year.
I know we've always got questions, and I always immediately go off piste because, unless I'm wrong, but there's not a precedent of these types of this way of doing it. Is this kind of in other countries already, and we're like, okay, this makes sense, let's bring this to Australia? Or is it a case of this felt like the right way of doing it here?
There's different incarnations over the world. Kind of the most obvious one that anyone who listens to an ID podcast will probably have heard of is sort of Bank ID in the Nordics, where banks collaborated about 20 years ago. Very different model, and it's more of a sort of login method originally. The other sort of nearest equivalent is probably Interac in Canada. So they do banks and provincial governments there, of allowing you to sort of reuse those and log in there. I guess where it came from, though, is kind of really the massive size of the problem, right? Sort of the scale of fraud, scams, just in general, the cyber breach galore that this country's been through. And banks, major participants in the economy, looking at things to say, hey, we can't solve for this alone. So how do we collaborate, right, as part of that? And the bio is, we're part of what's called Australian Payments Plus, which nobody will have heard of. That's okay. It's a brand new name. We came together about 2.5 years ago, but we brought together eftpos, BPAY, and the MPP. So Pay2, PayID, and also Beam, the peer-to-peer wallets. So we've sort of been running critical national payments infrastructure for 30 odd years. And then we sort of looked at over the last 3-4 years, how do we replicate that for data and identity? Yeah. So there's some learnings we can take from overseas, but it's new for Australia, new for certainly this part of the world.
If you were explaining how digital ID benefits a customer, how would you explain that? I mean, I think it's kind of obvious in a way how it benefits the banks that are participants, but how would it benefit a customer?
I mean, I put it down to a couple of things, but fundamentally it's protecting yourself online, right? So it's reducing the amount of data you have to share. The example I always give, and it's no slide on the company, but I had to do it recently, is if you're signing up for an account with Airbnb, you're having to grab a passport or a document. And what we've done is basically we've taken these paper and plastic credentials and we've slapped cameras over the top of them, right? That comes with a whole heap of unnecessary data, additional risk, additional friction for the business and the consumer. And really with using a digital identity and using an identity provider through ConnectID, you can just say, hey, I am Andrew, tick, right? Or I am over 18. You don't need to share the license number, the expiry dates, all these sort of extra pieces that the business doesn't want to store fundamentally. So the customer, that's easier. The customer experience is also quicker. So you think about the conversion rate for businesses and for customers, it takes 10 seconds to do that on your phone, or on average it takes about 90 seconds to go and find the document, take a photo. That's sort of what we see from our customers. So just the customer experience is far easier. It's 5 taps instead of cameras typing, fat fingers, etc. And then within the banking app as well, you can also see a consent history. So where did I share what, when, and why, right? So it gives you that kind of sense of control of if there's another breach. Oh God, did I share my information with Airbnb, for example? And on what date and what did I share? So it just gives you that sense of control and comfort. So that's fundamentally what we kind of see from individuals.
A number of statements for you, and you can comment on them how you like. First one is, I always, it's funny you were saying about taking a picture. Like I always call it a physical ID for a digital world. It's not fit for purpose. One of my bugbears in this space I've found over the last 18 months or so is the lack of appreciation for this space. And it feels like it's a huge, huge problem. What, $60 billion worth of fraud across Australia. You've got $2.7 billion of scams out of people's pockets. And yet there's no big tech in here trying to take it on. There's like some kind of, yes, there's some organizations have to be interested. They have to say yes and nod because to be seen to be interested. But the uptake and the appetite still feels really, really low. And it's frustrating for me now. I've kind of looked under the hood a little bit and gone, "Whoa, this doesn't look great. We need to try and fix this problem." Are you seeing and feeling the same? Because you work much more closely with the kind of big banks than I do. Like, is that are you seeing that?
What are we seeing? I guess we're sort of seeing the green shoots of it. And you think about the sort of trend of where Australia's been, right? So it's 2015, the federal government started looking at how do we legislate for this, and spent somewhere in the order of magnitude of sort of 600, 700 million thinking about how do we do it. Different podcast for another day on that, but and I'm conscious John Shepherd sat here, who's a wonderful human being and has kind of finally got it over the line, which is really, really important. But as a country, it's taken a bit of time to figure out, well, what do we want this to be? And also the last couple of years, I think we've seen far more of a shift of feeling ready for it. And I think, unfortunately, that's because of the breaches, right? I think before that, would we have been at this point in time where businesses were ready for it or individuals were ready for it? Maybe not. I think the catalyst of 2 out of 3 Australians being involved in a cyber breach in the last couple of years, I think we're first or second in the world in that gold medal tally, so that's a cracker, has helped crystallize that, oh, hey, I really need to think about this, right? And the sort of risk compliance department is starting to beat the marketing department in old, hey, should we actually store this data? How do I reduce the amount of risk we actually store? So we've had a really good year of some businesses coming on board. The most kind of relevant for day-to-day audiences at the minute is Dan Murphy's and BWS. So you can use ConnectID through that to just prove you're over 18 and verify it at sort of point of sale and set up an account. And a lot more coming next year, but it's starting to get into that sort of daily life cycle. But it's a 10-year mission, right? This is not a overnight success. And I guess the question, sorry, maybe just your statement, do you want big tech to come in and solve for it as well?
Yeah, it's not yet as in yes, it's a good question. I don't know is the answer. It just there's a big problem. There's a big bounty for someone who can solve the problem. Yeah. So it feels like a space, and it's technology. It feels like a space they should be. Whether I'd want them to be, I don't know. It feels like a space they should be.
I think it's also a good question about whether, there's the sort of supply side and then the demand side. So, you've got the supply side, what are the technology providers and the solutions available? But then there's the demand side, how do we get Australians much more comfortable with digital ID? I mean, you bang on, Andrew, 2 out of 3 Australians have been affected by a data breach or a scam, but there does seem to me to be still this degree of reticence that people have, or lack of knowledge about, the product that's out there that can be used as an alternative. I mean, how do you deal with that? Or have you noticed that, and how do you deal with it?
So we definitely notice it. It's new, right? But I think there's a bit of a, as an industry, we looked at it probably from the wrong end of the kind of looking glass. I don't know why we're trying to explain digital ID to people. This concept, I don't expect the vast majority of the population to know what a digital ID is. I just want to rent a flat, or just want to prove I'm over 18. Yeah. What we're hoping with ConnectID and talk about the sort of supply and demand sort of side is that by getting major banks on board, we know from all the research in the industry, people trust banks. They may not love banks aggregate, but they trust their bank, right? As a sort of pretty clear defining statement. And they also want choice. So choose my bank, or in the future, choose a state government or a private sector provider. But we've got a bit of education to do to say this is not a new thing to set up. You don't need to download something. It's not a new step. You already log into your banking app, 5 to 30 times a month. That's all it is. Just logging in, verifying, consenting. So there's a bit of a hurdle of education to get across for sure. There's a bit of an education of, I don't think this is as hard as we're sort of making it sound like this grandiose digital identity macro challenge. It's just day-to-day interactions. How do we just really cut through that and say, this is easier than you think it is?
Is it a bit like multi-factor authentication in a way? Like, know, where basically banks kind of made it very difficult to opt out of that, right? So in order to kind of progress through your banking app, you had to kind of set up multi-factor. Is that the way of the future? Like, almost making it compulsory, if you like, or largely compulsory. De facto, better word for people.
Well, it's certainly not compulsory or de facto. I think it's very clear in all the work we've done, the feedback we've had, and also what government have seen, that it has to be voluntary to take place, to have any sort of trust. Australia voted down a national ID card spectacularly, as the UK, right? It's not a country that wants something forced upon them. It's got to be done by choice. As part of the ConnectID flow, it is an individual consent every single time that you see the attributes you're being asked for. So there's nothing happening behind the scenes. So it's express consent from the individual. But it's making sure they know, what it is and why it's easier. But there's got to also be alternatives for those who are not digitally active or kind of part of that, part of either banks or state government identity pieces. But we've got to steer very clear away from compulsory, mandatory. I think that's where this falls over pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think it depends on how you look at it. In a sense, the way that I view this whole space is that government and big organizations had their opportunity with my identity and they kind of failed me, and therefore I need to take control of my own identity, and I should be the one in charge, and therefore I feel it'll be consumer demand that leads this more than anything else. It's not about the bank being safe and secure. It's if consumer demand says I want to do it this way, which is why ConnectID is so good in the sense of it's easier for me just to click ConnectID and link it, opposed to filling out all my details. It's consumer demand because they'll log on and go, ugh, they haven't got ConnectID. I liken it to when if I'm buying something on my phone, it doesn't have Apple Pay. I'm like, oh, now I've got to go and get my bank card, and you know what? I can't be bothered. And I stopped doing it. So it's consumer demand that will drive this. But then you've got the whole chicken and egg scenario around you need at least a few people on it, understanding it, to be able to create the demand in the first place. And then I always talk about kind of the importance of the first domino.
Yeah.
You got to get that fallen over, and then from there it should be downhill.
And it's a multi-sided marketplace, right? So starting, I think we've now just gotten to 4 major banks on board, which is a very exciting milestone, which means the sort of broadly 75% of the country could use it day one, which then means as we're building out post Dan Murphy's BWS, those next kind of customers coming on board, which we've got some exciting ones we're hopefully able to share next year, we'll start to see those sort of headline names using it. And the so what? All right, I can see it now, I can use it, I get it. I've used it once, therefore I'm more willing to use it again. Because at the moment, it's how do you come across it in day-to-day life?
And I think that I kind of always look at this space as with like think of it like a bell curve, split it into 3 segments, and you've got your innovators, which are legislative or because I have to verify people today. Then the next segment, your early adopters are people who want to verify. And then the entire rest of the market is people who don't. And kind of the don't examples, let's say the iconic signing up for an account, the people who want to might be the higher industry. They don't legislatively have to, but they should do to protect their assets. And then you've got the people at the front who are FSI, who legislative have to. If you can win that small piece at the front, like you say, with the 4 big banks at 75%, everyone has one. They've already gone through that first kind of experience of using it. Then it makes sense if they want to go and delve into that world of the people who don't have to, that whole bigger part of the market. I'm quite happy using it there, even though if I started there, I'd never do it there. So it makes sense from an adoption point of view.
It does, and I think that it's the large sort of leading figures typically, fortunately for us, are sort of at the forefront of this, which is awesome. Although probably interestingly, 70% of the relying parties on board are small, medium businesses at the minute, right? So they're the newer startups or the adopters who actually, as we're setting up a new business, I'd far rather just verify Rob is Rob without having to capture his details.
Mm-hmm.
So they're looking at it from ground zero rather than looking at it from a legacy enterprise that's having to go, God, how do I change my systems and move like this whole thing across from what I used to capture 2 documents in a biometric check to a reusable digital ID. These startups are looking more at, oh, well, I don't have to capture it. That's awesome. I'll just get a is over 18 flag instead. Yeah. So we're getting both, which I think is really important. Yeah.
The want part of that adoption curve, that will be a majority of the people who are doing it manually and so on today. Is there an option for ConnectID? How does someone do that if they're an offline business?
There will be next year to be able to offer sort of a decoupled start and branch flow.
Okay.
Effectively. Nice. So whether that's bank branch or something else, Dan Murphy's BWS in store, the ability to do that in store. We're also looking at doing that across things like mobile driving licenses, and New South Wales has its own variation of that. But that's something that is kind of squarely on the roadmap to allow for an in-person verification as well.
Nice.
You mentioned, Andrew, one of the really important features that kind of Australians want out of a digital ID system is voluntariness. But you also hear and read a lot about security and privacy being really critical and really important in terms of uptake, like you were talking about, Rob. You hear some commentators also talking about digital ID being a honeypot, right, for cyber criminals. So can you talk to us a little bit about security features and privacy and how that's been built into the ConnectID platform?
Yeah, glad you brought up the word, because we have gone for a zero honeypot approach where whilst we're an exchange or a network, we don't actually sit in the middle of any transaction. So we just connect the bank that's sharing the information with the customer consent to the relying parties to verify it. That's it. We don't see any PII. We don't store any. We don't want any. I think this is the kind of core philosophy for us. How do we reduce the amount of data that's being shared around the place rather than add any more risk? I think that's the way you reduce it. You keep it where it should be and you share the absolute minimum going forward. But we're fortunate in the partners that we've sort of worked with, that we've built things to sort of bank grade encryption levels, heavily regulated entities in the banking world, but we're also accredited under, I guess, what was TDIF and is about to become the Digital ID Act. We're the only exchange that's credited under them and have been for the first 3 years of its sort of draft framework. So again, some pretty high bars to clear there in terms of privacy, encryption, sort of safeguarding personal data, and fraud, sort of profiling and networking tools as well. So we know it's a really important thing to give Australians confidence and Australian businesses confidence. And we've, I guess, lucky in our design and the way we've thought about, you don't get too many chances to build something like this, and you make a mistake once, it's not a happy place to be. So we've started from a pretty high bar of security and encryption and rules and governance. And that's the other part of the scheme in the network. There's the platform and infrastructure layer, but there's a sort of scheme rules and operating procedures, which is the less fun thing to talk about in the podcast, but is how do you have sort of a mutual level of trust between all participants, from liability to insurance to reporting and fraud and sort of privacy constraints as well. So yeah, it took 3.5 years to get to year 1 as a result.
Does an exchange negate the need for a digital ID?
Oh, no, not in any way. It means you can have multiple. That's the beauty for us. We want use the 75% stat, but 75% of the population is not the goal, and the goal is not 100%. The goal is 200 or 300%. How do you give people choice? All we do is we're Rails. We point you to the identities you already have and the places you can use them. So we think it makes it easier for businesses in particular. So you don't have to integrate with 5, 6, 7 different digital identities, or a state identity service or a federal government identity service. You just plug into one and you get them all as a result. So, but I think to your point, right? Consumer demand will say, actually, I want one for my financial services transactions. I want one for holidaying. Maybe I want one for state governments. I think different circumstances, you might use different providers. And that's exactly what we want to see.
And what about multiple providers from an exchange point of view?
I think there was more than one, and there's now down to one. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's a couple more pop up.
Who was in? Who was?
So MasterCard were in the market for a while.
That was an exchange, was it? Okay.
An exchange and an identity provider service. They were playing multiple roles in there. I think they're having a bit of a pivot. I think the kind of core piece for us is we just want to focus on what we're really good at, which across the payments world is just the infrastructure network layer, and let others do the awesome digital ID experiences and just help them do really well.
So maybe, Andrew, you can help our listeners understand the difference between a digital ID provider and an exchange. So, and I'll give it a go, and then you can correct me. So in my mind, I'm a bit of a visual person. Like, I'm imagining an asterisk, right, or a star, however you want to see it. And there's a point in the middle where all of the lines cross over. And for me, that's the exchange. The point in the middle is ConnectID. And then the top layer of the star or the top layer of the asterisk, they might be the digital identity providers. So you might have multiple, you might have a Privy ID, or you might have whatever other MyGov or
MyID, sorry.
MyID, yes, MyID. And then at the other end of the star down the bottom, if you like, are the businesses or organizations that need to know one aspect of someone's identity, or, if they are who they say they are, or if they're over 18. And am I right in imagining that you guys in the middle of the star, it's about connecting the digital ID providers with the companies that need to know pieces of information about that person?
Pretty much. That's it's not exactly how our architecture diagram works, but it's pretty close, right? It's sort of we're kind of like a switchboard, right? We're just sort of pointing traffic in the right direction. The one-to-many sort of model, whether it's payments or identity, is kind of it, right? So the main difference for us is that it's the consumer that picks the identity provider every time. So you land on the Reliant Party site, so continue with Airbnb, you'll see verify with ConnectID, and there we'll drop down a list of who those identity providers are you can choose from. So today that's the 4 banks, but absolutely we want that to be more banks, state governments, private sector providers to add to that as well. And the customer chooses. So then they click on insert a bank, because we don't pick favorites, and you get redirected to that experience. So you then log in with your bank, see the information that's being requested, whether it's name, date of birth, whatever that is, and consent to share that back, and then you go back to Airbnb.
So it's very much like the OAuth, right, that exists right now, or when you, for example, when you got asked to log into a particular platform, like let's choose Airbnb again, you can choose to log in by your mobile, your email, but also by Facebook or Google. So it's the same kind of user experience, I guess, that you're offering for consumers, is that you can actually drop down and pick, log in via ConnectID with your Privy identity, for example.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I have this scenario where, say I'm selling a motorbike, and you come round to buy the bike, and you go, can I take it for a test drive, right? Because the motorbike, we can't go together. And I'm like, are you going to ride off with my bike or not? And let me grab your ID, and you might have a My ID and I might have a Privy ID. And so they can't talk to each other today. But if ConnectID is into both of those pieces, then theoretically it can connect the two and go, yes, this is the translation piece. So therefore I can make sure I've got your identity. So if you do ride off with my bike, then I can get to the police and go, Andrew stole it.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that to you, but I don't have a bike, so. But yeah, exactly. So it's largely today for sort of online platforms, but for peer-to-peer sort of verification as well. There's no reason why we don't do that next, right? So being able to verify that, I'm the person that's turned up, or I am the tradie that's come round. My licenses and credentials are valid, right? To be a plumber and I'm authorized. You can do that as well. It's a natural extension next.
I like your adverts. I'm a big fan of whoever does your marketing. Love them. I think, did you see, although you're not meant to be in the room, you saw one on a bus, I think, somewhere. We always get sent them into our Slack channel whenever someone sees a ConnectID. We take a picture of it and put it in our Slack channel. But what's the next step, in a sense of there's the chicken and egg, which is the consumer and the enterprise. Are you going after both immediately? Is it a case of trying to recruit enterprises, but kind of brand awareness to the consumer so they feel more comfortable with what it is? What's kind of major step? I mean, I'm such an advocate for ConnectID, as well as the whole kind of regime that's happening. We need to uplift this. We don't necessarily know what in 10 years' time the right answer was, but we kind of have to light all the fires and see where we get to, and we'll be fluid and iterate as we get there. So what are the big milestones for ConnectID over the next kind of coming 6, 12, 18 months?
It's largely the two you just mentioned. So it's getting it in the hand of more customers by onboarding more enterprises. So 2025 for us is growth, scale, adding more businesses who can use it, which involve a range of sort of tier 1 household names, and also continue to support those small, medium businesses. And then educating consumers. That might be more things on buses, which are sort of, we think, really good campaigns, and I'm glad you like them.
Yeah, great.
Also using it through banks as partners, right? So if you go to a CBA branch today or CBA ATM, you'll see ConnectID being shared there to start to educate their consumers. Because they have a far bigger voice than us.
Leverage
right?
credibility.
Yeah, right. So they want to be able to explain to customers, for CBA customers and other banks as well, right? But when you see this thing, it means the bank's behind it. You can use it. It's safe to do so. It's a good thing, right? So that education will continue, but it will probably be leaning a little bit more into the bank channels and partners, helping explain not just what it is, but where you can use it and how you use it. That's the difference in sort of year 2. The more places that actually go and use the thing. And
hopefully you've learned from the advertising campaign around PayID, which was terrible. I still don't understand the fish and what the fish had to do with MPP, but anyway.
Don't know if I was around for that, so I'll take no credit or no harm. But I'm happy to take the feedback.
It has reminded me a little bit actually about the rollout of the MPP and how I think I've been surprised at still the uptake hasn't been as strong from consumers around the new payments platform. So, that Osko symbol on your pay, it's basically real-time payments using a mobile phone or an email as your identifier instead of a BSB and account number, right? It's heaps easier to remember your mobile phone or your email address. But I still find that if I'm transferring friends money for a concert ticket or some other reason, or splitting money over dinner, people still do the BSB and account number, right? There's still, even though there's a much easier, better, simpler way.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I get annoyed, a bit like the Apple Pay scenario. Yeah. If I go to send my mate money and I put their mobile number in, or you can kind of look at their contacts and it goes not available for, and I'm like, But also whenever there's that sharing or send me your bank details, we share BSB account number. Right. We don't just share your mobile number.
And then maybe it's been around
it's habitual
for a long while, and still it doesn't have that level of uptake that I would have expected, having been in the banking world when it first started.
It just shows how hard it is to shift that habit, right, and move it across. And I think what we're seeing is bigger uptake from businesses in particular, less so the consumer, but from businesses who want the money in real time. So it's explaining the need to the businesses more so, of small businesses, even, seeing tradies, hairdressers using PayID as a way to receive money, because you get it immediately. It's instant. So it's it's part of a kind of long-term shift to real-time payments away from BECs, from direct debits across Pay2, PayID. And there's a whole heap of work to do to help accelerate that, but also just continue to educate.
I'd be interested to understand whether you've had conversations about the experience with the uptake of PayID and, how you can accelerate, I guess, the uptake of digital identity through ConnectID, given it's all part of the same organisation.
Yeah, no, we do. There's a lot of common learnings of, doing big infrastructure things with big banks, take time. And there's also a bit of education and even over our first year, right, we've had to be aware and conscious of our fourth bank's just gone live. Third was in the winter. I keep doing that still in this country. Winter in this country. I still haven't converted fully to seasons. From day one, it hasn't had ubiquity, right? So it's adding features, adding capability, adding coverage all the way through. And that's similar to the challenges that the MPP and others have sort of faced over the last couple of years. So it's getting to that point where it's ubiquitous to then shared and do far more. But lots of learnings.
I would like to shift gear a little bit.
Oh, yeah?
Actually, if it's all right with
What are we going
with
up
you,
or
Rob
down
and
again?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion over the last week in particular about the government's plan to put age restrictions on social media. As a mother of two teenagers, one who's nearly 16 and one who's nearly 13, you can imagine the debates that go on in our house. One very smug, nearly 16-year-old who won't be affected by this, and one very nervous, nearly 13-year-old who potentially will be. One of the things that is relevant, I think, for this podcast is around the verification piece. How do you ensure that someone is the age that they are, particularly when you're dealing with minors? And I guess one of the potential technology solution that's been floated is digital ID. So I'm wondering if you gents would like to kind of give your thoughts on this topic.
It's a topical topic, isn't it? It's an interesting one. I was listening to radio and the host was saying it feels unfair because why is it that the people who behave themselves on these platforms have to be punished because a few don't? And why is it the big platforms who seem to kind of get away scot-free and there has to be a rule that is dragged into place, which I completely agree with. It's what's being talked about at the moment are kind of big four platforms: TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, X, whatever it's called, and banning them. But it's where do you stop? And I'm a big believer on tools versus solutions in a sense of this is an idea of a tool for a potential solution of making it safe for everyone to be able to kind of be in the right areas. Whether it's the right tool, I don't know. I think something needs to be done. I call it anti-social media. I think it's the devil. So banning it for some, I think, is a good thing. We should just ban it for everyone.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah, I think it's horrible. But it's difficult. I think I don't know what we're protecting against. Are we protecting against minors being kind of approached by people who are pretending to be younger than they are? Are we protecting against depression? Like, what are we trying to actually achieve? Is it all of those things? I don't know. I'm not sure that is the right approach to do it. I just think we need to put more pressure on the platforms to do a better job at patrolling and controlling those areas to stop the bad things from happening.
I think I'm largely with you. Look, the policy is a different debate all to itself, and I've got a 1-year-old, not a 16-year-old, so I'm at a very different sort of stage of how does that impact sort of his future, and what will social media even look like then. It's undoubtable there is harm on those platforms, right? Abuse, trolling, fraud, scams. It's pretty horrible place at times. I think my bigger nervousness is with the verification steps, right? And what the sort of risk that we government sleepwalk into another issue where we just slap cameras over passports and make every 15-year-old, 16-year-old take a photograph of a document and do a biometric check to prove they're over a certain age, right? I hope that we've moved on a little bit more from there and there's better technologies, digital ID obviously being one, or really strong age estimation technologies perhaps that can help do that. But I don't know if as a country we've learned enough of those lessons yet. So my bigger concern is we sort of take a very blunt instrument and try and slap it on technology companies and we collect a bucket load of data from 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds that we just don't need, right?
Yeah.
Or even younger, right?
It feels cart before the horse a little bit in the sense of we're about to get this digital ID thing moving forward. Why don't we get that in place and then we can use that to help patrol this, opposed to I'm a huge believer in everyone. I was a big fan of when LinkedIn verified all of their users, because there's a big part of the social media world where you can hide behind a avatar, right? And I think if you're verified, you can't hide anymore. You can be banned, and you can't just then create a new email address and create a new account because it's tied to your identity. Yeah. So you have a responsibility to act a certain way, and if you don't adhere to those policies, that's it. You can only do that once, and then you're gone. So I'm a big believer in you should be verified, but as Andrew says, that's got to be done correctly. It can't be done how so many businesses do it today, where it's just creating a honeypot. I won't use that word again.
I agree with you. Users have the right to know if you're a real human being or not. The sort of Twitter X bots nonsense that we're in at the minute. So you have the right to know as a user, am I speaking to a bot or am I speaking to a real person? I think you have the right to have a at Mickey Mouse handle. There has to be a real identity behind it.
Correct.
So
yeah,
that
it needs to be tied. Yeah.
if at Mickey Mouse 123 is causing harm, the real person gets binned.
Yeah.
Right. But I think there's still the right to have some form of pseudonym or anonymity on it.
Yeah, 100%.
It's still going to be verified as a real person, a real identity with real recourse if you stuff it up.
It's interesting that you say that that's a right. I mean, I find that really interesting, this idea that you have a right to be anonymous, because I'm not sure that I understand where that comes from.
Subject to the platform, right? I think it's different in a banking world or something, but on Twitter I want to be called at Mickey Mouse, or I want to sign up for a newspaper subscription, but all you need to know, or a Spotify subscription, you just need to know I can pay the bill. You don't need to know, Andrew.
Yeah, in the same way that you can have a persona, right? And I think that the same way an actor plays different roles on social media, there's a platform there where you have a followership. People should be able to play a certain role. If that creates followership, then that's fine. You don't have to be authentically exactly yourself all the time. I think that's fine.
Wow.
But I think my point is it has to be bound to a real person.
Like we're getting into a philosophical podcast, actually.
Which is then, how does government regulate for that?
Yeah.
Right? Like there's so many different incarnations of that. How do we get it right?
On episode 2 of Idiot Proof, we had Becky Holmes, and she talks about romance fraud. And so the big challenge in that space was when X made it verify, you could pay for your verification. It meant that a Keanu Reeves impersonator could pay to be verified as Keanu Reeves because their verification was so poor. You just needed a phone number. That meant that suddenly Keanu Reeves with a blue tick messages you. You kind of think it's Keanu Reeves, but it's not. And so that really kicked in a level of, I think we had, so I don't know if you know this, but romance fraud is the 3rd highest fraud in Australia. So of the 2.7 billion, romance fraud was $206 million in Australia. And that's typically people pretending to be someone they're not. And then they do that again and again and again. So yes, you can be anonymous in that situation, you can do it once. But once you're caught on the system, you can't do that again. If you had digital ID on there.
Yeah. I don't know that stat. Jesus, terrifying.
So Andrew, thank you so much for coming on our podcast today and sharing your insights. It's been a really interesting discussion. And before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to share about, your vision of digital ID in the future, or where you think it's going, what you think people should be excited about?
Firstly, thank you for having me. It's been really fun. Not a philosophical debate I thought we'd get into, but it's been awesome. I think I'm excited for sort of the 1 year and the 10-year sort of version. So as you're building something new, I'm really excited for what we'll see in another year's time, and all the use cases we haven't thought of yet. Right? The things we talk about today are fun and we think will be really powerful, but actually there's probably a lot of use cases we haven't even thought about. But I'm honestly just super passionate about what this will do for society overall, right? We talk about fraud, we talk about scams. What we haven't really touched on is, digital identity has the ability to help people who are really kind of marginalized in the community, who face awful circumstances, whether that's in this country, disaster relief, flood relief, bushfires, have to leave the home quickly and don't grab documents, right? You just take a phone and set life up again. So rent a place, get a new SIM card, a new phone, open a new bank account. And also those who are kind of typically left behind in society today, right? So a lot of First Nations Australians who don't fit into a 100-point check, really neatly. So I think that we all have a duty to make sure we design for all, not just a replication of today's experience. But I think that long-term vision is really exciting. And one I love working on.
Awesome. I love the expression of you always overestimate what you can do in 1 and underestimate what you can do in 10. It was Bill Gates, I think, again, who said that. But I think what will be great, I know this wasn't even my question, is that we always talk about, we're trying to solve a problem around the kind of fraud element. But what we haven't even looked at, and what's really hard to get your head around, is what are those positives that this will create. Yeah. And I genuinely believe it. Once you get the digital ID part in, there's going to be so many great things, those kind of green shoots that will come from this, which we have no idea what they look like today, but they will start to appear over the next few years. And I think that's what's exciting. And what's great is having you on here is it feels like there's a very small community who are pushing the digital ID bit, which is slowly growing. So it's great to have you on here and have a positive, let's go and fix something.
Yeah, well, one podcast at a time.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. Today, Rob and I had the pleasure of speaking with Andrew Black from ConnectID, gaining insights into how Australia's first digital identity exchange is setting new standards for secure, efficient and user-controlled identity verification. I think one of the things I liked, Rob, in this episode was how Andrew talked about the benefit of using digital identity not only for individuals looking to protect their personal data, particularly in light of the amount of scams and frauds in Australia, but also that there's a better way for businesses to verify their customers, and having ConnectID as the bit in the middle of the asterisk or the bit in the middle of the star, I think really demonstrates how that network can work really positively together.
The orchestration layer.
That's it. What about you, Rob? What did you like about today's episode?
You know what, more than anything, it's just ConnectID for me are one of the few who are really doing it. There's so much theoretical conversation around digital ID, be that from the law that hasn't come in until another couple of weeks, through to a lot of companies, Privy being one of them, who are kind of playing in this space and doing a little bit, but we're not doing a lot, where ConnectID now with the big four banks, 75% of Australians, like that suddenly feels like a big fundamental step to getting this in place and working. And we're not looking for, I don't know what the right solution is, but I think there's a better solution out there somewhere. It could be ConnectID, it could be my ID, it could be Privy, it could be a bit of blend of all of it. But ultimately, we just need the whole scenario to be better. And ConnectID feels to me like they're leading the charge a little bit and making it happen, which is great.
Yeah, it's awesome. So look, if you've enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to Idiot Proof for more discussions about the future of digital identity and how it can transform the way that we connect and engage online. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Welcome to Idiot Proof, the podcast dedicated to digital ID.
In this series, you'll hear about everything from the recently passed Digital ID Bill through to some of the creative and abstract ways in which digital ID can be and is being used today.
I recently wanted to amend something on my will, and I thought, okay, when do I travel to Estonia? I need to book a time, la 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 la. And then I realized I can actually identify with digital identity and get that done, even though I'm in Australia. Life is just easy, and more they're seamless services.
As a podcast, we want to bridge the gap from what the F is digital ID
through to that sounds great, get me one of those.
With digital ID, you obviously do an initial verification of your core documents, and then that ability to reuse that over and over. My biggest bugbear is trying to drag the birth certificate. Every time I have to do that, I'm just like, oh, God, that's a pain. Plus, who's getting it?
Your hosts are the lovely Sally McKenzie and myself, Rob Hotchin.
And I think one of the good things about the digital ID is that it really prioritises choice. You'll start to see innovation.
Sometimes feel like I've got a car and I'm selling to someone with a horse. And I think that people don't always realise there is a better solution.
We hope you enjoy listening and maybe even learn a thing or two. I know I will.